Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 15th annual Gruss lecture here at NYU. It's a I have to apologize on behalf of Moshe Halbertal. He had a little medical emergency, nothing serious, etc., but it prevented him from flying from Israel. So I apologize on his behalf. It's a pleasure to welcome Suzanne Last-Stone. The usual cliche actually applies here. She doesn't need an introduction. She's splits her time between Cardozo and Tel Aviv. She's been the Gruss professor at Harvard, at Penn. She's one of the most interesting writers in the field of Jewish law and the intersection of Jewish law with moral philosophy, political theory, and sociology, I should say. Always worth reading, always worth listening to, and I'm sure this will be borne out today. Welcome, Suzanne. There will be time for Q&A at the end, and we have a reception outside, and it's truly kosher. It's not kosher style.
Thank you. First of all, thanks so much to Professor Weiler and to all of you, and it's wonderful. I just got off a plane from Israel, and it is absolutely wonderful to see a lot of familiar faces. So, hi everyone. So I plan to take you tonight on a tour of some fascinating biblical and rabbinic texts. But I'd like to first identify the problematic that led me to these texts. And perhaps the best way to do so is by unraveling the title of my lecture. I did try to compete with Sally with lecture titles. I'm not sure that I hit the mark, but I have at least a double alliteration here. So let me explain these double alliterations in my title. It'll give us a kind of introduction to what the texts are going to circle around. So the first is prophets and public intellectuals. I'm okay here with the mic? You can all hear me? Yes. Wonderful. Okay. Now, we are used to thinking of prophets as social critics or moral visionaries. And so coupling prophets with public intellectuals actually seems a bit of a commonplace. The biblical prophets were certainly that, as well as intercessors between God and the people, religious virtuosos, who managed God's emotions, as Yochanan Mufs put it. But the crucial feature of prophecy that I will focus on tonight is the reception and disclosure of divine information. In other words, prophets are people who have privileged private knowledge of divine truth and impart it to the public. And this is an institutional role. It's part of the division of labor described as in biblical society, along with judges, kings, etc., in Deuteronomy 18. Yet, as Deuteronomy also warns, a prophet may presume to speak in God's name a word that God did not command him to utter. The biblical record is full of portrayals of so-called false prophets, although that term is a difficult one because it actually doesn't appear in the Bible itself. The term false prophet, right, it first makes its appearance, right, in the Septuagint. And we'll come back to that, I think, later as to why that might be, why the exact term, Navi Sheker, actually only appears later. But prophets are not only people who might speak in the name of foreign gods. They're individuals who succumb to external pressure, the wish to be popular, to go along with the group, to appease the reigning powers, or even internal pressures of wishful thinking. And so in Deuteronomy 13, right, prophets can also be described as dreamers of dreams, people who are led astray by their imagination. In short, both prophets and public intellectuals hold themselves out to society as possessing privileged, special knowledge, and yet they may be subject to external and internal pressures that cast some kind of shadow, right, on their message. Now, obviously, this places a burden on society, that is, what resources does society have to arbitrate between experts? But an equally pertinent question, and the one that I'm interested in, is what obligations should the prophet or public intellectual have before speaking? What are the responsibilities of those who would hold themselves out to the public as having special knowledge? And that question turns out to be hotly debated today. The answers range from, speaking truth to power, getting it right, to articulating something useful without necessarily concern for the truth. And we might note, right, this has become the subject of philosophical, political theory debate, as well as something that you read about all the time in the newspapers. So let's take a thinker like Richard Rorty, who thought that a concept of truth, of getting it right, had no place in the forum of public reason, of political discourse between citizens. And John Rawls even famously said, "A political conception of justice does without a concept of truth." That is, a concern with truth is both an obstacle to getting things done, and worse, is potentially divisive. In response to this turn in contemporary political debate, the late philosopher Bernard Williams offered a fascinating defense of the virtue of truthfulness. And he tackles head-on a question that's central to my talk tonight. What are the responsibilities of those who hold themselves out in public as having special knowledge? His answer is that there are two duties, or what he also terms virtues, and he uses capital letters to demarcate them: sincerity and accuracy. Sincerity involves spontaneity. It's the virtue of genuinely expressing to others what one in fact believes. But that's insufficient, and precisely as Williams details, because of these internal and external dangers, right? The psychological forces that beset people. And so the virtue of accuracy is that of investigating, using the best methodologies for truth acquisition available, right? The truth of the matter before one expresses it. Now, this may seem, right, to be something commonsensical, merely commonsensical. In Williams' hands, it's not quite just commonsensical. It's actually a fairly brilliant genealogy that he does of Western thought in arriving at this. But I want to highlight it now because I think the terms that he sets by juxtaposing sincerity and accuracy, right, are ones that we should remember as we go through our texts. Before I do so, let me say one other word about the other alliteration in my title: truth and trust. Right? So what Williams gave, right, was a genealogy of the idea of truthfulness. And for that, he goes back to the Greek sources that shaped Western culture. But there is another heritage, and that heritage is the biblical heritage. And there we find something interesting that we also want to keep our mind on as we go through the sources, which is, how do we actually translate the word emet? And how do we actually translate the word sheker, right? Emet for truth and sheker for lie. Well, we might begin to think that the terms that we want to use are not truth and falsity, but rather trustworthiness and lack of trustworthiness. The shaker, right, is actually, let's even think about the very common phrase, Netzach Yisrael lo yishaker. This doesn't imply lying, right? It means there will be no breach, right? God is steadfast, right? And he will not breach the covenant, right? So it's a very interesting way of actually understanding what these terms mean. They point us in a somewhat different direction from the one we are used to speaking about when we talk about true and false prophets. We might want to begin to think about it as trustworthy or reliable prophets and untrustworthy or unreliable prophets. And I'm just putting this as background in order for us to begin to tackle our texts. So, I might finally add, right, to keep with the theme of my title, that perhaps it's no accident that Cynthia Ozick articulated the duties of the public intellectual, not in terms of truth, but actually in terms of reliability, decency, and loyalty. That is what she puts on the table as the measure of how we should judge public intellectuals is their character. So yet another thing that we might keep in mind as we now go through our texts on prophecy. So what is the goal of my lecture? 2 points. First, let's look at some interesting texts and let's see whether beginning to think in kind of theoretical terms, in terms of contemporary debates about the duties of people who hold themselves out to society, right, as experts, whether that helps us to unravel some of the interesting peculiarities in our texts. And second, the other large picture point that I want us to keep in mind is one of the great functions of law, which is managing doubt. Right? That's a cross-cultural purpose of law, to manage doubt, right? To make decisions in the face of uncertainty, whether it is about who is a prophet, what is the law, or what are the facts. And we tend to tell a modern story, an intellectual conversation, a story in which doubt, uncertainty, and with it the rise of the idea of trust is a modern invention. And these texts, I hope, are going to dispel that story too. So let's begin. You all have the text in front of you?
Yes.
Good, okay. So obviously, all our problems would be completely solved if we had a clear-cut way to distinguish between true and false prophets. And the Bible, right, in Deuteronomy, does offer 2 tests, right, of prophecy, right, disqualifications. A prophet who incites idolatry or speaks in the name of other gods is by definition false. Right? We can look at first text. As for all other prophets, this is source 1, Deuteronomy 18:21 through 22 declares, and should you ask yourselves, how can we know that the word was not spoken by the Lord? If the prophet, this is source 2, I think, right? Let me get my sources in front of me so that I'm looking at them together with you. Yes, look at source 2, Deuteronomy 18, or at least it's the second quote. And should you ask yourselves, how can we know that the word was not spoken by the Lord? If the prophet speaks in the name of the Lord and the word does not come true, that word was not spoken by the Lord. The prophet has uttered it presumptuously. Do not stand in dread of him. Now, is this a good test of prophecy? It might be if you had a very long time. Right? But, you know, if you need to act in the present, it's not that useful. Right? The test of history is not useful in the critical juncture when the community needs it. Second test, in the first source that you have in front of you, in Deuteronomy 13, that the prophet will produce a sign or wonder, as did Moses, the paradigmatic prophet, as evidence that he has been sent by God. Yet, Deuteronomy also warns, right, let's look at verses 3, 4, and 5, right? You can look along with them. These are not the texts that are really going to be so intricate yet. But the Deuteronomy warns that God may test the nation by sending a prophet, or what is described as a dreamer of dreams, who incites idolatry and still produces a sign or wonder. And this raises the dreadful question whether the production of a sign is irrefutable proof of true prophecy in other cases. So from the very beginning, looking at Deuteronomy, prophecy is clouded in doubt, even though Deuteronomy 18 also vests the prophet with authority. over what is a matter I will put off for tonight because they will take us astray. What I want us to do instead is to look at some other biblical tests for prophecy that slowly emerged. Certainly, Maimonides has a clear-cut one, which we may or may not have time to discuss, which is a prophet who annuls Mosaic law, right? Must be disregarded. But another test, which is quite rare, is that one that I want to focus on, and it appears in the Babylonian Talmud in Sanhedrin 89a. Now, you can start flipping to source number 5. We're going to first look at the Mishnah and the Tosefta, right, on page 5 of your sources, okay? So Tractate Sanhedrin deals with the capital law, and among capital crimes is the offense of false prophecy. What then is the definition of a false prophet? So if we look at Mishnah Sanhedrin, we see the following formulation. A false prophet, he who prophesies what he has not heard or what was not told to him, is executed by man. But he who suppresses his prophecy or disregards the words of a prophet, or a prophet who transgresses his own words, his death is at the hands of heaven. So, what is this description? Is this a detailed description of false prophecy, a false prophet, or is it actually 3 categories of prophets? Now, I'm not going to spend time trying to precisely tease it out, but you might take a look later on and you will notice, right, that while the Mishnah actually is written in a way that suggests that he who prophesies what he has not heard or what was not told to him is a definition of the false prophet. When you look at the Kaufman manuscript of the Mishnah, and then we look at the way in which the Bavli works with the Mishnah, you will see that it actually is translated as 3 different cases. There is the classic false prophet who speaks in the name of idols. Then there's he who prophesies something that was not said to him, and he, right, who prophesies something that he has not heard. The Tosefta takes that way of looking at it, 3 different cases, and it inserts examples. So, the one who prophesies concerning something he did not hear is Tzedekah ben Hananiah, and the one who prophesies what was not said to him is Hananiah ben Atzor. So one is a plagiarist and one is an inventor. These are the categories. Now, there's something rather, let's work backwards, because what we're really going to concentrate on is the Talmud's absolute confusion and perplexity about this tradition that they have inherited, that the court must execute, right, Tzedekah, a prophet in the position of Tzedekah ben Hananiah, who comes under the category, is the paradigm of the prophet, right, who said something he did not hear, presumably meaning he did not hear from God. Now, why? So flip backwards to page 3 and 4, because now we're going to look at a story. And we're going to look at a story that I'm sure you've seen many times, but you might not have paid attention to the precise problem, right, that is now perplexing the Talmud. Everybody with me on the story from Kings? How many of you remember this story or know it very well? Okay, good. But for those who don't, I think you're going to enjoy the drama of it. So I will summarize some of it and we'll read some of it. What happened? So a king of Israel, who is identified in verse 20 as the notorious Achav, invites the king of Judah, Jehoshaphat, to mount a joint campaign against the city of Ramoth Gilead, held by the Arameans. Jehoshaphat expresses a desire to consult the word of the Lord. And so before they begin, Achav assembles no fewer than 400 prophets who prophesy with one mouth, which we might translate as in unison. Bepeh echad. Go up, and God will give it into the hands of the king. Jehoshaphat immediately asks, wait, isn't there another prophet to consult? And Achav answers, yes, there is, Micaiah, son of Imlah, but I hate him because he never prophesies good concerning me, only evil. But Jehoshaphat insists, and Micaiah is summoned. Meanwhile, one of the 400 prophets, Tzedekah, son of Hananiah, provides himself with iron horns, and according to verse 11, says, with these you shall gore the Arameans till you make an end of them. In verse 13, you can all look, the messenger comes to fetch Micaiah and tells him, look, the words of the prophets are with one accord, right, literally, bepeh echad, favorable to the king. Let your word be like that of the rest of them. But Micaiah insists that he will speak only those words that God instructs him to say. Micaiah initially prophesies that the king will succeed, but when pressed to speak the truth, he prophesies disaster. At which point, Achav turns to Jehoshaphat and says, didn't I tell you he never has anything nice to say about me? Now, this is all foreground for the genuine drama, right? It's prophet contradicting prophet. And how does one know whom to believe? Micaiah, in verses 19 through 23, tries to authenticate his prophecy by reporting an astonishing prophetic vision. Who wants to read verses 19 through 23 for us? 19 through 23. I'm going to call on Ed, just so he can stop texting.
I'm not actually texting. I'm looking up something about prophecy, but I'm happy to read.
Okay.
He said, therefore hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven in attendance to his right and his left. The Lord said, who will entice Ahav so that he will advance and fall at Ramoth Gilead? One said thus, and one said thus. Then a spirit came forth and stood before the Lord and said, I will entice him. The Lord said to him, out.
Said to him, out. Go. Okay, now. Well, that is what happens. And in fact, right, Achav is lured to his death, right? He goes off to battle and is lured to his death. Now, obviously, there's a very profound and very troubling theological issue here, right? That is, right, the role of the lying spirit, the notion of, right, a revelation that is doubtful in and of itself, and there's more to it than that, which is, who exactly is the false prophet here? Tzedekah, who articulates what he believes sincerely is a message from God, or Micaiah, who's leaking information that God may have wished to keep hidden. Right? That's quite difficult. But you know, the Talmud doesn't address these theological problems. It is concerned instead with a question of justice, and specifically the integrity of the court, who presumably must sentence Tzedekah as an exemplar of the prophet who prophesies what he has not heard from God. Right? So this is the beginnings of our Talmudic inquiry, right? What exactly is the culpability of Tzedekah? Why is it a problem? Why is his culpability a problem? What do you think?
How can you believe the prophets if one tells you one thing and one tells you something different, especially being dishonest?
How can we tell which one is which? But what is he, I mean, he's been, what happened to him? What happened to Tzedekah? How could he?
I didn't read that far.
Oh, you didn't read that far. But no, I mean, after all, when we looked at Deuteronomy, right, we talked about, right, the prophet who presumes to speak something that God did not tell him. Now, presume is actually a technical word, right? Asher yazid, which comes from the term mazid, right? That is, it's an intentional act of wrongdoing, right, an intentional act. So we have a legal standard here. We need to find somebody who has deliberately, right, deliberately passed off a message that is not from God. But what happened to Tzedekah, according to the story we're looking at? What happened to him? The lying spirit, right? Sent by, right? A lying spirit was put into his mouth. Right? Ruach Sheker. Right? Didn't we just read that in? Right?
The lying spirit was to take and turn the prophets around to confuse them.
It turned them around?
Well, to confuse them that they might prophesy wrongly.
That they might prophesy wrong. But how is that intentional wrongdoing then?
That wouldn't be for him if he got the message from God, but
If-
if he's just speaking in order to get ahead of him.
Right. But here, if he got it from God in the sense of from a lying spirit, right? It's not a message from God, but from a Ruach Sheker, a lying spirit. How is he culpable? It's very perplexing, actually. Now, the Talmud's answer to it is going to, in some ways, amuse you, but I think we should take it very seriously. Okay, so let's read the Talmud's answer to that. I just want to focus everybody, make sure you see the problem, right? There's a problem of trying to find culpability here. After all, right? Court's going to have to sentence, this is a capital crime. How is this a capital crime? So, indeed, the Talmud begins by asking, right, what could he have done? The lying spirit was misleading him. So we need a legal justification somehow. And Tzedekah's fault, the Talmud basically concludes, was in, right, ignoring deliberately evidence that would have led him to suspect his experience. So let's read. I'll read this time. He ought to have scrutinized the matter in light of what Rabbi Isaac said. For Rabbi Isaac said, one communication may come to several prophets, yet no two prophets convey their communication in the same way. Now, we should read this in the Hebrew because it also has far more resonance in the Hebrew. Okay, we are on source 5. Page 5, at the bottom, right? We're on source 5, right? He who prophesies what he has not word, that's a quotation from the Braita. For example, the Tzedekah, the son of Hananiah, right? As it is written, and Tzedekah, the son of Hananiah, made him horns of iron. But what could he have done? The spirit of Navot had deceived him, as it is written. And the Lord said, who shall persuade Achav? The material we just read, right? And God said, right, to the Spirit who said, I will persuade him. Go forth and do so, right? So now, here's our answer. He should have scrutinized in accordance with what Rabbi Isaac said. The same communication is revealed to many prophets, yet no two prophets prophesy in the identical phraseology. Thus Ovadia said, the pride of your heart has deceived you, while Jeremiah said, your terribleness has deceived you and the pride of your heart. But since all the prophets spoke exactly as the others, it proved they said nothing really divinely inspired. But perhaps, the Talmud goes on to say, Tzedekah didn't know of this criteria. Then how would we be able to find him culpable? Ah, says the Talmud, Yehoshaphat was there and informed him. As it is written, And Jehoshaphat said, "Is there not here a prophet of the Lord besides, that we may inquire of him?" "But behold all these," said Achav. He, Jehoshaphat, responded, "I have a tradition from my grandfather's house. The same communication is revealed to many prophets, yet no two prophesy in the identical phraseology." Now, of course, this is a very torturous and fantastical chain, right, of transmission in order to resurrect the culpability of Tzedekah. I want us to put that element of it aside and take the rest of it quite seriously, because the question that we have to ask ourselves now, right, is what exactly is the Talmud's picture of prophecy that emerges from this? Right? Here we have the case of a prophet who is sincere but mistaken. Okay? Sincere, right? He honestly believed he was prophesying, right, and had a message from God. He was mistaken, he was deceived by a lying spirit. Right? And yet, the Talmud says, he's culpable. He's culpable because he had available, right, modes of inquiry by which he could have tested his prophecy. So for one thing, let us notice the following about the nature of prophecy, which is that prophecy is a kind of two-stage affair, isn't it? Not a one-stage affair. Right? Now, that is in part somewhat at odds with certain of the presentations of classical prophecy, which describe prophecy as, right, a roar. Right? You're possessed by a prophecy and you roar it out in Jeremiah. It's also at odds with what we might say, right, is the Kierkegaardian description, right, of what it means to have a religious experience, right? Something very immediate, right? Something immediate and impossible to suppress. But in the Talmud's imagination here, of course, it's very clear that there's a gap. Right? Prophecy involves two steps. One, having an experience, and then the entry of critical judgment. And that entry of critical judgment is what, right, is the time gap between having a prophecy and uttering or suppressing a prophecy. Right? Now, in that time gap, right, the text assumes that prophets engage in very critical reflection. Or let me put it in different terms, using the terminology of Bernard Williams. Sincerity is not enough, right? To come out spontaneously, right, with what you genuinely believe is not enough. If you're in a position of holding yourself out as an expert to society, then you need to engage in critical reflection to ward against what might be, right, deception of various kinds, internal and external pressures. External pressures, like the lying spirit, or internal pressures, which have to do with, right, over-imagination. Indeed, the medievalists described prophets, right, as often victims of the imagination. Right? They weren't able to tell whether their dream was a natural dream or a prophetic dream. Right? And therefore, right, there was something about that need for critical reflection, right, that breaks up, right, the moment of prophetic experience with what actually is averred or avowed. That's an interesting aspect of this text, because indeed, if we take it to its logical conclusion, it has much to say about something like the Akedah. What was the Akedah? Right? Should Abraham have questioned his prophecy? Now, maybe we'll come back to that in the question and answer, but this, in fact, is a text that opens up an inquiry, which is followed up by the commentators later on, about precisely that. Now, if we then see that prophecy is actually a site of doubt and questioning and struggle from the beginning, not only for those to whom the prophet speaks, but actually for the prophet, right? Actually for the prophet. Then I suppose the next question that we might want to deal with, and I think it's a very interesting question, is what is the nature of this test that Rabbi Isaac puts in front of us? So I have 3 theories, and let's see whether we can come up with those theories. Let's recall his test, right? His test is, right? The same communication is revealed to many prophets, yet no 2 prophets prophesy in the identical phraseology. Now, obviously, it's a great description of biblical prophecy, right? We see prophets, as he cites himself, Avadia and Yirmiyahu, who are telling the same prophecy, but in slightly different language, right? But it's meant here to be more than just a description. It's also meant to be a normative test, right? It's a measure, in some fashion, of the authenticity of a prophecy. How and why? And what can this tell us?
Well, I think we have a parallel with regard to false witnesses.
Ah, very good.
You have two witnesses who both say exactly the same thing. It's an indication that they are...
Okay, you've got one of my 3. I'll come back to it in a minute. Fantastic. What else?
I think if all the members of the Sanhedrin vote the same way.
What happens? Right.
So-
Right, we somehow suspect unanimity. There's something about groupthink and unanimity that we don't like. What else? Well, let me cite a few statements. Let's see if we can come up with a theory from these few statements. I'll tease it out. Let's see. So, Psalm 62:12, the verse says, "Once God has spoken, but twice I have heard." Right? And it's explained by Abaya as follows. A single verse has several senses, but no 2 verses ever hold the same meaning. Does that seem reminiscent of this statement in any way? Or how about this from the Mishnah in Sanhedrin? What is the greatness of God in creation of humans? Man produces many coins with a single stamp, and each is a replica of the other. But God produced each human with the stamp of the first Adam, and yet not a single person resembles his fellow. So that's my hints for you about a second theory. Okay? So, we got takers yet? What do these statements have in common?
I have a problem that, are we expecting him to go to the other prophets and get their versions to see if that matches with his or same conclusion?
Ah, okay. So, actually it's interesting because the story's quite careful that way. Tzedekah, not the 400, is identified as the prototype of false prophecy in this category, right? The 400 have already spoken. He heard them. What should he have done? Right? He repeats their message. So I think that actually is a kind of logical answer to your question. Yeah.
Thank you. I came across a quote that I happen to have
Yeah.
on my phone. It's from the preface to a book by Stavia and Gabriel Rosenberg on Akara. And this is from Rabbi Dr. Lord Jonathan Sachs, and he speaks of Navi and what the word means. He points out that the root, Nun Beis Aleph, means to bubble up, and by extension to speak words that bubble up, to mouth words in a mad sort of way. And his proof text is from 1 Samuel's 18:10, Vayit Nabeh b'toch habayit, meaning that it's the speaking words that well up inside the particular prophet. Therefore, end of the quotation. Therefore,
It would seem the
it has to
opposite
be-
of what I've just described.
No, it's proving your point, I think.
Yeah.
It's, in other words, it's individualistic.
Ah, okay.
It comes from the prophet.
That's my third theory. It's individualistic. Okay, so let's go over it. You've got them all, almost all. You didn't get my first one, although I gave you a lot of hints. So, okay, so here are 3 theories of what this very odd phrase means. The first is, maybe it's actually a mark of divine communication. That is, achat shamati, right? Once God spoke, twice I have heard. Meaning, there is something about divine language in rabbinic parlance. We're speaking about rabbinic parlance, right? The way in which the rabbis generally understood the nature of revelation, in which revelation is multiple because of the human, right? The human interaction with the contents of revelation. God doesn't produce replicas. That's what Sanhedrin is telling us, right? No two people are alike, though they come from the same coin. One message, right, can be sent to several prophets. It will not come out in the same way, right? That is a mark of divine language, and right, and that actually makes the test a kind of sensible test for trying to understand, right, what is a sign that this is a message from God. Right? It has to come out as stylistically variable. It has to come out as different. There has to be plurality. Ivan.
It's very interesting that you started out with Bernard Williams, because in his lectures, he used to often state that incompletion is the gateway to modernity, meaning that as humans, we can only do so much. It's never complete. So in a certain way, it goes to what you're saying about the prophets, that if it's a God inspired message, it's got to have that notion of completion, because Williams would never agree that there is such a thing as a human. Of course, he was a non-believer, so we have to start with that. But that there's such a thing as providing an absolute prophecy. So there's a tension.
So that it's not going to be the definitive. It's not going to be the definitive version of what God said in some fashion. And that leads to the second point, which is, and I think this is the point you're making by citing the etymology of Navi, which there's some way in which prophecy involves an individual, not an automaton. Indeed, now that's right, there's language that indicates it even in our text that we're just looking at, though they vary. That is, in Deuteronomy 18, if you go back and look, it actually, God talks about putting words in the prophet's mouth. But when we get to Kings, that's what the lying spirit does. It's put into the mouth. It doesn't actually, right, it doesn't actually involve a dialogue of some kind or a relationship. And it is possible that stylistic variance, it surely doesn't mean something as modern as originality, because after all, originality is the definition of false prophecy. But stylistic variation, right, does indicate that there's a person on the other end. And in different ways, more radical and less radical formulations, the rabbis actually wrote a great deal about the human factor in prophecy and how much humans contributed to it. And that may be then the significance of this test on that level. So we have two ideas so far, right? One, it actually is a mark of divine language. You can be sure that if it is the same message announced by several prophets in the same language, that can't be from God, right? Because that violates the rabbinic conception of what revealed, right, of what revelation is about. And secondly, that there's an aspect in which this kind of in unison, right, in the mouth, cannot possibly be the product of an encounter, right, an individual encounter. The third, I want to get back to yours, because I actually find it, though it's rather formal, I find it to be the most interesting of all the explanations. And why? Because I don't think, it's so straightforward, but it's the straightforwardness of a common lawyer exercising the powers of analogy. Let's think about it. Why would you analogize a prophet to a judicial witness? Let's just think about it. Right? You're searching around, you want to figure out what are the laws of prophecy, and you think as a common lawyer, well, what is an analogy to prophecy?
Testimony.
Hmm?
Testifying that that's what God said.
It is testimony about a private matter, right? That you bring out into public that cannot be verified in any other way, right? A witness comes in and says, I saw something. You weren't there, nobody else was there, but I saw something. I saw it, right? And now that's going to have force. And that's the gist. In fact, it's the troubling aspect of prophecy, according to later critics of prophecy as a ground for political authority, or moral authority, like Kant and Hobbes. It was precisely the fact that it's private and can't be verified that deeply disturbed them. And that's the essence of the analogy to the witness. The witness comes forward with crucial information, in a public forum, and it's information that was gathered in private. And so the analogy seems to me to be rather sensible and straightforward. Now we can take a look at the passages in the Palestinian Talmud, in the Talmud Yerushalmi. My old habits as a graduate student are showing up, in the Jerusalem Talmud. And we can take a look and see what's going on.
Just one, it's maybe the same as one of your three.
Yeah.
It did seem to me that one can view something as propaganda when you see something repeated constantly. If you get 1,000 messages to your congressman all having the same language, you know that it's propaganda, and you can, from a false spirit.
Right. More than propaganda, what do you know that it is? Everybody agreed together, right? It's collusive.
It's collusive, yeah.
It's collusive, right? It's very commonsensical, but it actually tells us something rather interesting about prophecy, and I think will be very neatly tied together with what Maimonides does afterwards. So let's look at the Palestinian Talmud. Benzi, hi, how are you?
Okay, thanks. I read the four verses from Yud Gimel to Tet Vav.
Yeah?
A bit different.
Okay.
There is a messenger that comes and tells the true prophet, listen, everybody agreed, and he adds a very crucial word. Everybody agreed good. Everybody liked what they said, and the king liked what they said. So why don't you just follow them? And he comes and he follows, but he's under oath. He was Mushbar, the king, and the king tells him, "Why you lied to me?" How did he know that he was lying to him?
How did the king know that
Right.
Micaiah was lying to him in the beginning?
The king hears 400 people
Yeah.
telling him.
How does
one
Yehoshaphat
story.
know?
I'm sorry.
How does Yehoshaphat or Achav later?
How does Achav know? Yehoshaphat is just there listening. He wants to know what the guys have to tell him.
But
And he
it's
comes-
Yehoshaphat in the beginning, right? In the Yehoshaphat who listens to the 400, and then there's a gap,
Yehoshaphat-
and he immediately says, I need another prophet.
Yehoshaphat is the only one who does true due diligence. He wants to know. This fellow comes and he says, you know something? Everybody agreed that it's good. And be careful, it's good. So he comes and listens to him and he does it. Unfortunately, he's under oath because
Yeah.
the following verse he tells him,
Page 16.
That's
"ויאמר אליו המלך עד כמה אני משביעך." I made you swear
Yeah.
that what you're saying is the
True.
truth, what God tells you.
Yeah.
How does he know that?
Right.
He already made before.
Meaning,
before
how does
made
he
a
know that
statement-
what Micaiah, the first time Micaiah answers him and says, go, right? How does he know that that's not
So
the actual prophecy?
You're standing here with
Yeah.
a Sanhedrin that says everybody is guilty or right, and he comes. He's not going to be Yotzei Min HaKlal or Poresh Metzibur. Says, yeah, you're right. And not only that, he knows that everybody agrees that it's good. In fact, in his guts, he knows that's wrong. And eventually, he has to stand up to his principles and say,
Who's
"That's
the
true."
he?
The,
Micaiah?
Micaiah, yes. He has to say the truth. And in his truth is what God told him to say. And he said to him, listen, I
Yeah.
cannot say anything but what God tells me. He said that before he agreed with the 400. And
No,
yet
no,
he
no,
was
no, no,
willing
wait
to.
a minute. There are two different characters here, right? Tzedekiyah and Micaiah.
No, I'm talking about Michaiah. Michaiah is...
The one who's on the dock, right? The one who's the subject of the Bavli's concern is tzedekiyah.
Is the one that was called to come and agree with the 400.
He was called to come, and the messenger says to him,
Right.
agree with the
And
400.
he
But the
says-
person that the Talmud is concerned with is the liability and culpability of tzedekiyah.
Yeah, but Tzedekiyah would come back later on. Tzedekiyah tells him, "Eizeh avar ruach Hashem meiti."
Right,
How
right.
can you do that? How did you take
Okay,
my
so
spirit away?
I'll get back to that in one moment, because I think that, I mean, there's a lot going on here in the text itself that we haven't, because I've concentrated on the Bavli. I haven't talked about that, but actually, and maybe this is the time, although I want to get back to the Palestinian, to the Talmud Yerushalmi. Actually, from the very beginning, the oracle is completely ambiguous, actually, right?
That's exactly right.
That's exactly right. From the beginning. From the beginning, it just says, right, go to war, the king will win. It doesn't say which king. The Arameans, right, or the Israelites. There is no right. It is a completely ambiguous oracle from beginning to end. And actually, when you think about it, when you think about this statement that later on Tzedekiyah makes to Micaiah, how is it that the spirit of prophecy can pass from me to you? And in essence, he's in some way asking, how is it that the same message came to you and to me, and you interpreted one way, and I interpreted another, right? And in fact, the text that Rabbi Yitzchak is quoted as saying might be seen to be completely rooted in the story, right? That is the same message, an ambiguous message, comes to both prophets, and they each interpret it differently.
But in the Devarim, he tells you, "Ki menaseh Hashem Elokecha." How does you know? How does anyone
Who's
know
the
which
he?
is the experience? God is trying someone? How do I know?
You don't know. How do you know?
No, but he said.
So here's their struggle. Betsy, I'm not sure I'm understanding your question, but let me do the following. Let me go back and talk a little bit about the Talmud Yerushalmi and address the question of witnesses and the Rambam, and then we'll come back to this, okay? Because I need to try to understand your question in a deeper way. So let's look at what the Yerushalmi does, right? Everybody have, right, we'll go to page 6 and 7. And actually, I have to apologize that there's a part of this that you don't have in front of you as a source, because it actually begins with a statement about the prophet who speaks in the name of idols. And what the Yerushalmi says is that the prophet who speaks in the name of idols comes under the rubric of an 8 sheker. Right? That is, comes under the laws of a false witness. The reason it's specified, and not simply, right, a clear category of false witness, is because false witnesses are not put to death, right, except in the case of Edom Zomimim, right? False witnesses don't merit the capital punishment, but the false prophet does. And so the prophet is specified, even though it's simply the category of giving false testimony, right, in order to make clear the punishment. After that, the Talmud Yerushalmi gives us some different interesting situations. So in the first one that you have in front of you, there's the recounting of a debate. What if 2 prophets who are in the same city give the same message? Not in identical language. It doesn't say bepeh echad. It's not in identical language. They give the same message. Do they need a sign or wonder to authenticate them? And that's a debate. One says no, and one says yes. And presumably, what could be the answer? What could be the reason that we could dispense with the authentication of a sign or wonder? What might be the reason? Well, what are the prophets? To follow your analogy, they're Shnei Eidim. They are 2 corroborating witnesses, right? And then we can move a little further down in the Yerushalmi, and we can see a quotation about the practice of Rabbi Huna. And what was the practice of Rabbi Huna? Rabbi Huna's practice was to strictly examine the witnesses whose testimony is worded in identical language, right? They get intense scrutiny because of the suspicion that they colluded and invented their testimony. And it turns out, when he did that, he was right, right? That is, right? Saying something in identical language with someone else, identical utterances, those are deeply suspicious. We have that very instinct, and they're disqualified as witnesses. And hence the legal term of art that appears in the Bavli. What should Tzedekiyah have done? He should have scrutinized, bedika. He should have done a bedika, a check, right? Which is a term that we use for scrutinizing the testimony of witnesses. Now, why I find this fascinating for two reasons. The first is because I think it illustrates something wonderful about the jurist's mind, right? We can go from high theology to something very commonsensical about what exactly is the dilemma that we have in front of us. But I also find it very interesting because I think it is deeply behind the way in which Maimonides treats the problem of prophecy. So let's turn now, right, to Maimonides for just a moment. Right? Let's look at, yes?
Why aren't the whole 400 prophets under the same situation that Tzedekiyah? Why aren't they required to?
Well, presumably. I asked this question to myself. Why aren't they the paradigm, the 400 prophets?
Or why aren't they just as guilty?
Why aren't they just as guilty? So here's what I think is a simple answer, right? If they actually are seduced by the lying spirit and they come out with it all in the same way as the text implies, then they've spoken sincerely and they have no capacity to check their prophecy. Nothing has intervened that allows them to check. Tzedekiyah repeats it. He heard a message in unison and he endorses it and adopts it.
He goes further.
Right, so I think that actually, if we're just looking at it from a technical perspective, it does answer that question, why Tzedekiyah is singled out. Because he's the one who avows it, right? He's the one who affirms it and avows it after having seen it.
He goes further. He goes one step further. He
Yeah.
says it's not that the king will win. He says, and Aram will have them by my horns. You'll kill him with my
Right,
horns.
right. I mean, he acts it out in symbolic language, right, and
He
through
goes further.
symbol.
He says, you're going to win, king, not the other things. They're like the oracles of Greece. They
Right,
make statements of that
Right.
general.
So I think it actually makes logical
It's a
sense.
suggestion then that the fact that the Spirit entered into you relieves you from culpability.
The Talmud begins with that question. Why is Tzedekiyah culpable? The lying spirit misled him. They've got to find something else, and they do, right? So that's exactly right. I think that's right. I think there is a sense that a prophet who is sincere, right, but erroneous, how do you give them the death penalty? How is that intentional misconduct? How is that deliberate? Where is the question of, right, mezid in there, zadon? Right? That's a real question. And for the Talmud to find it, it actually needs to see and structure a sense of prophecy that allows for an examination of critical reflection, right? And some opportunity to do so, right? It finds a kind of ability to discern that it's wrong and an intentional failure to do so, a refusal, in a sense, to do so. And that, I think, now this seems awfully technical when put into this case, but it's not technical because actually this is exactly, right, what we have really constructed, right, as something extremely important about our own debate, about the notion of how we speak, what our responsibilities are. Right? That's what we began this lecture with. What are our responsibilities? Is sincerity enough? If you're sincere but mistaken, are you off the hook? Or do you actually have some responsibility, right, to do something called critical reflection And what is that about? And that, I think, is actually something that the Talmud has constructed here. Has it constructed it to solve a local problem? Maybe yes, but actually, this goes much farther in terms of how the commentators later develop it. It goes far beyond the question of a local passage. Let's look also at Maimonides for a moment. So what is Maimonides doing? Here, what Maimonides is doing, right, is setting up an edifice, right, in which prophecy is both, right, an institution. Prophets need to be heeded. At the same time, right, prophets are dangerous, right, because we can't authenticate fully and finally who is, in fact, the true prophet, except in the case of Moses. Why in the case of Moses? Because it wasn't a private experience, right, according to Maimonides. It was public, right? Everyone was there, everyone saw it, everybody validated it. That is the only prophecy that is subject to verification. Everything else is not. And signs and wonders, of course, don't do the job, because as Maimonides said, they can be trickery. But as you read your way through Maimonides, note how, first of all, he is using the idea of a prophet bringing a sign or wonder, an oat. He actually uses it just as the Jerusalem Talmud does. He does it, right, as a synonym for a witness, which is a common parlance, right? What is the Sabbath, right? A sign or a witness, right? It is the corroborating witness. What else does he do with this notion of the witness, right? The idea of the judicial witness runs through the text, right? So why do we listen to the prophet? We do so, right, who brings signs, even though signs are not actually a reliable, completely reliable, foolproof mode of authenticating the truth of a prophecy. We do it for the same reason, Maimonides says, that we listen to the testimony of two witnesses who corroborate one another. Right? It's a presumption of the text. Right? And right, if the prophet, however, says something that contradicts the self-knowledge of the judge, then the judge throws it out in the same way that the judge throws out the witness. So the entire passage of prophecy in Maimonides is actually structured, as traditional commentators point out, right, on this Talmudic structure of prophecy and witnessing as being absolutely analogous, comparable functions. And it serves one other very important point for Maimonides. After all, in the end of the day, Maimonides says, you need to listen to a prophet who's not contradicting Mosaic law, even though we have, right, if he brings corroboration or if he brings, right, a sign or wonder, even though he really might be a false prophet, right? So Maimonides says, right? We just have no way of knowing. Right? So how do we guard against the problematic of that? Well, one way we guard against the problematic of it is the same way that we guard against false testimony. We have qualification rules. Who can testify, right? One of the ways in which we manage to safeguard the procedures of the court, right, is in fact, right, by only allowing credible and trustworthy witnesses to come by. And that's precisely what Maimonides does. He makes a list, right, of what it is that makes a prophet trustworthy. And what makes a prophet trustworthy or qualified, right, to act as a prophet, right, to witness, right? They're the virtues that are quite similar to the virtues that a sage possesses. That is, they're trustworthy. In the end of the day, for Maimonides, right, the only thing that counts, actually, is the reliability, trustworthiness, right, of the person who is testifying, right? And we give, right, that's what we take into account. It's character, right? It's virtue. So I want to go back to that because I think that's actually what I began with, which is, are we really concerned with the notion of truth? Or are we concerned with what makes people reliable, loyal, trustworthy, right, and credible, right, rather than looking at the truth of the matter? I think that's part of the deflection and part of the debate that actually is right now, in contemporary terms, part of what we struggle with when we listen to, right, experts and public intellectuals. And I think that's actually something that's quite an important question, right? That these texts, in their own very elliptical and implicit way, are struggling with as well. And they leave us with one other point. And then I'm going to go back to Bentzi and see if I can understand the question, right? They leave us with one other point, which is this question of managing doubt, right? So it turns out, right, now much of the Rabbinic Project is a project about how to manage doubt. That is, what is the law? What is the divine law, right? And it's a coming to grips with the idea that one needs to proceed, even though it's not entirely clear that the halakha is the halakha in the mind of God, if there is such a thing, right? Much of Rabbinic Talmudic culture, right, concerns this question about how to live with that anxiety and how to proceed forward, right, to manage that doubt. That is precisely the kind of attitude and mode of thought with which they are reading, right, accounts of prophecy. Right? Now, prophecy actually usually appears in rabbinic literature, certainly in medieval literature, especially when the medievals debated what was superior, the sage or the prophet. There were two different models of prophecy that were proposed. Somebody like the Meiri, or later Rav Tzadok Cohen of Lublin, right, spoke about the advantage of prophecy, right? Its machloket began when prophecy ended. Why? The advantage of prophecy was that it was certain, right? But in the picture that we have, and the picture that I think is actually quite a natural picture for the Bavli, prophecy is not certain. It's no less, right, uncertain and no, right, than in human intellectual. Right? Indeed, right? It poses precisely the same problems, right? Because after all, from what we've seen in our texts, prophecy is uncertain even for the prophet. Right? So with that idea, right, I want to end and take more questions. And Bentzi, I'm still struggling with yours.
Oh, well.
Okay. All right, I have a lot of questions. I have to give pride or place to Joseph.
So it's not so much a question, but a comment.
Yeah.
So this was illuminating. And if we take the common denominator of the rabbinic sources, without expressly saying that, there's a deep suspicion of prophecy. And there's deep suspicion of somebody who comes and says, God revealed himself to me and there's no way of verifying it. And there must be something innovative in the message, otherwise, what's your added value? And we see also, as counterweight to the suspicion, a great preference for the intellect, for scrutiny, for verifying. And I think one explanation for this, the sort of elephant in the room, is the emergence of Christianity. Exactly the time that Jesus was born.
So
in other words, it's a way of calling into doubt this alternative, this seductive
alternative. I mean, it makes sense what you're saying, but I have an impulse always. I said, oh, did you hear what Professor Weiler asked? Professor Weiler said, how much of this is really caught up is this deep suspicion about prophecy, which seems to be a theme within rabbinic right, within the Talmudic literature, how much of this is a reaction to Christianity and to the religious type of, let's say, Jesus, right, who is a prophet, right, who says, okay, I have a new law for you, right, and it's not the old law. And, you know, scholars are extremely, a lot of scholars have spent a lot of time thinking through this, and they've come up with elaborate theories. One in particular has to do with the notion that the Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, is extremely critical of prophecy and of charismatic figures altogether, because it's set more or less contemporaneously with the schism, whereas by the time of the Bavli, right, we have a whole different attitude, because this is not actually the social setting of the Bavli. I'm not really so certain, right? I don't really read everything in that way as a reaction. I actually think that, you know, the rabbis were extremely good readers of the biblical text. And the more one looks at the biblical text, the more one sees in the biblical text exactly the ambiguities that we just discussed before, which is that prophecy involves a great deal of ambiguity and interpretation, right? It isn't, in fact, right, the image that we have necessarily. And now there's a question about whether that's kind of the demise of classical prophecy, right? Whether you see that in the later books much more than you see it in the earlier books and classical prophets, right? But if we take our own story that we just looked at, right? Here are two prophets. They get this, right? They probably get the same message in a sense as the message of the text, because the oracle is completely ambiguous, and they each interpret it differently. So how did that happen? And so I think that there is in here, it seems to me, a kind of reading, right, of what it is, what was that legacy of prophecy.
The problem of alternative philosophy or prophecies is dealt with in the Torah itself.
Correct.
Moses put his hands on the elders and they prophesy. Then there are these two, Eldad and Medad, and they've got a different message. And it's Joshua who wants to clean them up. And Moses said, no, I wish that all the members of the tribe of Israel were prophets. So that doesn't seem to bother him that there are alternative views of what's called prophecy. And here we're so concerned with the false prophet. That comes up in Deuteronomy, that we're so concerned with the false prophet. But it doesn't seem to be the view before
Deuteronomy.
Yes.
You think there the view is that this is a natural phenomenon?
And then Rambam says it's a
Right, there are different gradations.
That's right. That anybody can attain
A certain level.
of prophecy if he reaches a certain level, a certain person, a certain mental capacity.
Right. But Rambam is dealing with two different things, one of which has to do with the private experience of prophecy. The second of which is what our texts in general, I think, have been dealing with and which I've pushed about, have to do with the public nature, right? Prophecy as assuming this public institutional role, not as being just simply a private experience for intellectual gain, but rather for the coming out with it in the lives of citizens, right, in public discourse, which has different ground rules. Yeah.
So I want to push you a little bit on the modern analogies. So what I was in fact looking for on my phone, as opposed to texting, was to try to remember what I knew about Bertrand Russell. And Russell spends a lot of time. Bertrand Russell spends a lot of time worrying about things like the liar's paradox. And what he's worrying about is his anxiety is how reliable is knowledge, and can you put knowledge on a firm foundation by using axiomatic set theory to provide a basis. It's an anxiety that is present, that is worked through, comes to its end with Gödel, who shows that there is no consistent way to do that. That's a very modern anxiety. That's an anxiety about the foundations of knowledge and truth in a non-theistic environment. And as you started your talk, the question, and throughout the talk, the question I've been wondering about is the differences between the modern anxiety that we have about knowledge and truth versus the rabbinic anxiety, which seems to be much less a question of the reliable foundations of knowledge construed generally, and much more of a question of whether the word you're hearing is the true word of God or has been corrupted.
Okay, so I think that maybe the way to think about it, and it's a great question, and I haven't thought about it at length, but I think the modern anxiety is about foundations, as you've said, right? Is there such a foundation altogether? Is there anything there, right? And maybe what we are looking at in the rabbinic material is an epistemological problem, right? Epistemological problem is not there's nothing out there. The epistemological problem is there's something out there, but I don't know exactly what it is, right? That is, I will never know, right? And that's a huge, and I'm glad you put this on the table because I think it's a huge and important distinction, right? A huge and important distinction that actually, you know, is the kind of stuff of, right, our legal theoretical debates, right? Is there one right answer to a legal question, right? And Dworkin will insist that there is, right? Even though it may be laid up in juris heaven and we will never be able to verify exactly what it is, right? So I think that in that way, the distinction is quite, right, is real and true. Now, despite that, what is Williams arguing? So I don't think Williams is actually trying to tackle the question of is there a foundation and is there truth? He is trying to tackle the question of truthfulness, right? That is the virtue of trying to get as close as possible, not maybe to the ultimate foundations, right, of our life, but to just simply what happened. Right? What happened, on what basis am I making and I coming to my conclusions? Right? And so that's where Williams lies. What Williams' account is an account of truthfulness, right? Not of truth itself. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, isn't this a military question? I mean, get the generals in, forget about this butting in prophet. The idea, and I think most of the time that the prophet's involved, is a question, are we going to fall into the hands of and get slaughtered, or can we get them and slaughter them? So the idea, these are military questions. The prophet jumps in, they want a guarantee. And you know, Napoleon said, there's no guarantee on the battlefield. You can win, you can lose. It can happen. So that's what's frustrating me, because I've just been reading about the Greeks and General Thucydides, a brilliant guy. He had a bad strategy. He's exiled. The next guy, a bad strategy. He's exiled. It's like more cut and dried. But here I see this whole thing. Not that they don't burn to the Delphic Oracle, but that's hoping for good luck, not trying to get guarantees. So that's a different, I mean, I really is a civilization.
No. I mean, look, if we go back and try to read the biblical record in terms of what the politics were, you know, maybe you're right. But I think from the long distance of the rabbinic lens, it's dealing with a somewhat different matter. Okay, yeah.
A comment and a question about the Al-Qaeda. My comment, thanks so much. I mean, this is really very thought-provoking. I don't know if your excerpt, I didn't find it in the excerpt of the Foundation of Torah Laws here, but I do recall from Professor Isidore Tversky the term active intellect. And the prophet is, every human being has the power of prophecy, even today. Today, of course, only fools will tell other people, you know, that you have a, but that's something that everybody has, and it's one's intellect that is bonding, perhaps mind melding, with God. The only one who has a true mind meld, to use
is Moses.
Exactly, because as you brilliantly summarized, he spoke to God face to face. Now, how do we know that? Maybe he just says that, as you pointed out, because everyone saw the public revelation, and etc. So therefore, we can trust when he says God spoke to him in private. Well, you know, he has a track record. And And he actually, so therefore we can believe, he actually did speak clearly to God. Every other prophet, as the rabbis understood it, is getting some kind of a reflection, some kind of...
Refracted, reflected thing.
Exactly. Therefore, Abraham, though, in the Akedah, and I'm quoting Mark Twain, I don't want my schooling to prevent me from being educated. Abraham actually says one clear statement, which is often overlooked in elementary school. V'nishtachaveh v'noah shuva aleichem. Rashi, of course, a great commentator, does comment. He has prophesied, and that's what Rashi says. So he makes a statement that we will return on his way to the man. He doesn't know how God is going to keep all, all his promises. He told him, this is now the subtext. He told him you're going to have, a whole nation from your own seed, from Isaac, not any other
He was the
son.
first one that was called Navi.
And yes, and so he actually spoke what actually did take place.
I should add, I think it is I've been glancing over some of this material, but I should add that actually Maimonides completely ignores the passage in the Bavli, in the Babylonian Talmud that we looked at, which makes this very interesting presentation about the sincere but erroneous prophet, in which prophecy is a site of doubt for the prophet. And actually, I think that Maimonides rejects that notion. Right? Maimonides actually writes that the prophet is never in doubt. Right? Something called the certainty of sight, right? And that's what he ascribes to Abraham. So that Maimonides' way of approaching this is very different from the rabbinic from the rabbinic stance that we look at in the Bavli. Quite different. Now, of course, he needs that. He needs that to do the work that he does in creating an edifice in which Mosaic legislation is secure, even as he admits the defects of all later prophecy. The only way to make Mosaic legislation secure is the notion that it was publicly witnessed and seen, and there is certainty of sight among Israel, right, in doing so, right? That can't be doubtful, right? So we have actually two very different, right, ways of approaching the problem, right? One of which is we can't write an epistemological, for Maimonides, it's purely an epistemological issue, but the prophet, right, is not in doubt. It's those who listen, right, who cannot verify an epistemological issue. For the Bavli, though, I think if we follow it logically, prophecy itself, right, the very experience of prophecy, as they have put it, and that is followed by other medievalists like Crescas and Ibn David, that is actually in itself a site of doubt and struggle. You have that turned around in the story of the Akedah, right, and in the theme of the Akedah, you have it turned around in Hasidic literature. There's a wonderful book by Yehuda Gelner called Fear and Trembling, takeoff on the title by Kierkegaard, who discusses Hasidic approaches to the Akedah. And the Hasidic approaches to the Akedah that he details essentially say, in essence, that the demand, which we kind of see implicit in the text of the Bavli, the demand for this kind of rational, critical reflection, for somebody in the position of the prophet to essentially step outside their own experience and look at themselves, almost like with a third eye, right, to abandon a certain kind of authentic first-person narrative and look at themselves from the outside through this kind of third-party position, that in itself, right, is extremely self-alienating. And it is self-alienating, and the greatness, right, of Abraham in Hasidic literature was, in fact, to struggle against the alienation of just this kind of critical inquiry. Right? And that's really quite fascinating because it extends the themes of the Bavli, but inverts them. Right?
What I'm hearing, and I don't have a background on it, you have a prophet who the king trusts, but he gives advice that's erroneous. And here you have another prophet who has their own agenda or their own ambition, and he gives the advice. Do the rabbis ever consider it that God looks down at the king and says, I've got a king here with a weak personality, indecisive, and no common sense. So I'm going to have the prophet that he trusts, I'm going to give him bad advice to give to the king so I can knock out the king.
You know what? That's a great instinct you have, because in fact, this is a theme in the passage that we read, the one that I glossed over in the interest of time. Who is the lying spirit, according to the passage that we read in the Bavli? It's the spirit of Navot. And who was Navot? Huh? What did Achav do to Navot?
Killed him.
He killed him. And was he right in killing him?
Of course.
No. So it was the spirit of, it was God's way of addressing justice. Right? That's at least what the Talmud is implying here. So your instincts are great.
Suzanne, I had a prophecy that people are getting
Hungry.
So maybe I should take maybe one more question. And
Are you sure about that?
I know that it was very, very interesting, thought-provoking. But we didn't really deal with this particular issue, but I was wondering what you would say regarding Maimonides and his connection between prophecy and witnesses when it comes to the question of women. Can women be
Prophets?
Because we know the Talmud mentions several women prophets, Deborah
Right.
and others, and yet it would seem, according to the criteria that Maimonides required,
If he
that
really
it-
wants to pursue the laws of witness testimony all the way down.
Yeah.
But maybe then what we have to do is distinguish between two kinds of prophecy and two kinds of witnessing. Women can be witnesses. They can't be public witnesses of a certain kind, and right? That is, formal witnesses of a certain kind. Right? They can testify about a variety of matters. That is, there's this distinction between the formal public role, right, and other forms of witnessing. And that's a distinction that he's also, I think we just mentioned it, right? It's also going on in his concept of prophecy.
it's a sign of a wonderful lecture that one has lots of questions one wants to go on asking. I must say that I've been to practically all the Grus lectures, and this really is second to none in its illumination and stimulation. I want to thank Suzanne Last-Stone, and I want to thank all of you for coming. And you're welcome to the refreshments outside. Thank you very much.